Hey everyone, Chris here. Thanks for checking out the podcast. If you're enjoying it and learning something along with us, please consider becoming a supporting patron at patreon.com/ateacherhistory. Or you could leave a rating and review on iTunes. It would be a huge help. If you'd like to raise your hand and participate along with us, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, @ateacherfist, or shoot me an email, chris@ateacherhistory.com. All right, let's get on to the next episode. Hello, and welcome into A Teacher of History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining me again today. Did you know that New York Senator Martin Van Buren and future 8th President Martin Van Buren was really the brains behind Andrew Jackson's campaign for the 1828 election? That Daniel Webster and Henry Clay, without the knowledge of John Quincy Adams, paid off journalists to write slanderous and untrue things about Andrew Jackson to blunt his momentum. And that just like his father, John Quincy Adams did not stay to attend the inauguration of his successor, too bitter and uncomfortable to participate. Did you know all of this? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out because today we will cover that and more in episode 116, the Mudslinging Election of 1828. All right, everyone, welcome into A Teacher's History of the United States in episode 116. This is one I've been looking forward to. I've always been really interested in the election of 1828. I think it's a real watershed moment in American politics for a lot of reasons. And we have, like I mentioned last week, when we had a shorter episode, we have a lot to get to in this one. So we're going to dive right into it in just a second. But before we do that, I do have a book recommendation. It is a book specifically about the birth of modern well, I'll just read the title. The Birth of Modern Politics. Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, and the Election of 1828 by Lynn Hudson Parson. So, pretty self-explanatory what it's all about. It is really, really good. So, if you're interested in the election of 1828 and stuff that I cover here today in this podcast, I would recommend you checking that book out. And of course, like all others, I will have it up in the book recommendations tab on the website. Last week, we started to dive into the presidency of John Quincy Adams. We covered the ambitious plans he laid out for America and how those plans caused the political divisions in Congress and the electorate to grow even deeper. We formally introduced the doctrine of nullification. As mentioned last week, this will become more important as we continue our narrative, and having a solid understanding of this Federalist principle will help you to better understand the motivations and justifications of many Southerners as America continues to move closer toward war. As John Quincy Adams entered the second half of his presidency, it was clear that he had created some momentum for an opposition party to run against him in 1828, but at least up to this point, they had not formed unity around one candidate. With John C. Calhoun and William Crawford still in the picture, sort of, along with some political disagreements between all of the members of this anti-Adams faction, the opposition was a bit disjointed. But what was obvious to everyone was that if they were able to all come together behind one candidate and one platform, John Quincy was going to be in big trouble. Enter Martin Van Buren, aptly nicknamed the Little Magician. Martin Van Buren, the only politician ever to be the primary subject of a Seinfeld episode, was at this time a senator from New York. As some of you may know, he will subsequently serve as Secretary of State for President Andrew Jackson and will be our 8th president. But at this point in time, he was still a New York State senator. But he wasn't just a senator. Martin Van Buren was incredibly influential in politics in a very important state. Some historians contend that Martin Van Buren may be one of, if not the best, political mind in American history. Van Buren understood politics better than almost anyone else, and he took the time to strategize, manipulate, and project into the future. Van Buren knew that the best and maybe only way to beat John Quincy Adams was to create a clear two-party system that could overcome any sectional or political differences. And Van Buren believed that the man they should all rally behind was undeniable. It was obvious. It was General Andrew Jackson. Van Buren wanted to create a national party, one that could garner support in both the North and the South, similar to the coalition that small government-minded Thomas Jefferson was able to put together in the election of 1800. Van Buren believed that there were many small government-minded Republicans in the North that disagreed with the direction that Adams was taking America and would be able to gather behind a man like Jackson, especially a man of fame like Jackson. Because from the perspective of Van Buren and others, while John Quincy Adams may technically refer to himself as a Democratic Republican, he was really just a Federalist. To Van Buren, Adams was nothing more than a wolf in sheep's clothing. By the spring of 1827, Van Buren was working diligently toward the creation of a unified national party, which would become the Democratic Party, while Andrew Jackson was beginning to formalize his candidacy and organize efforts throughout the South and West to position himself as the true competition to John Quincy Adams. And to be fair to Jackson, his biography sort of spoke for itself. I mean, he was an American hero, and he fought for American democracy. His allies traveled all over the South and the West, stumping for their candidate, reminding the American people of his wartime valor and commitment to the people. His belief and support of democracy was the linchpin of his campaign. In addition to the active campaigning and organization, Jackson's contingent also focused on another method of increasing their chances in the election: expanding voting rights. At this time, each state had different rules on how electors were chosen in their state and what people had to do in order to qualify to vote for these electors. And by people, I mean white men. The Jacksonians knew that if they were able to petition states to lower the requirements for voting, they would be able to recruit more lower-income voters to the polls, and those people would likely vote overwhelmingly in favor of a Democratic central candidate like General Andrew Jackson. What ends up happening is that between the year 1824 and 1828, Jackson's campaign effectively embraced a more democratic process and greatly expanded voting rights in some areas. And here are the numbers. This is how the numbers bear out. It's really incredible how much it expanded. In the election of 1824, about 350,000 votes were cast. In the election of 1828, it was 1.14 million. This will give Jackson a huge advantage heading into the election. Following the campaign of 1824, Andrew Jackson, as you know, was beyond frustrated not only with his defeat, but what he believed was a corrupt process that cheated him from his opportunity. But it wasn't just that. The campaigning in 1824 had been more intense than we had seen up to this point in U.S. politics, even though we will see it increase substantially in the election of 1828. One insult that Jackson took particular offense to was when Henry Clay would openly condemn him for being a military chieftain. Jackson claimed to not fully understand what Clay meant by that, but he took it personally nonetheless. Jackson, in trying to explain himself and provide some perspective, responded by saying, quote, and this is a long one, so listen closely. It is very true that early in life, even in the days of boyhood, I contributed my might to shake off the yoke of tyranny and to build up the fabric of free government. And when lately our country was involved in war, having the commission of Major General of the Militia of Tennessee, I made an appeal to the patriotism of the Western citizens, when 3,000 of them went with me to the field to support her eagles. If this can constitute me a military chieftain, I am one. Aided by the patriotism of the Western people and an indulgent providence, it was my good fortune to protect our frontier border from savages and successfully to defend a vulnerable point of our Union. Our lives were risked, privations endured, sacrifices made. If Mr. Clay pleases, martial law declared, not with any view of personal aggrandizement, but for the preservation of all and everything that was valuable, the honor, safety, glory of our country. Does this constitute a military chieftain? And are all of our brave men in war who go forth to defend their rights and the rights of their country to be termed military chieftains and therefore denounced? I became a soldier for the good of my country. Difficulties met me at every step. I thank God it was my good fortune to surmount them. The war over and peace restored, I sought to retire again to my farm and private life, were it for the call of my country to defend it. I should have contentedly remained. If this makes me so, I am a military chieftain. Listening to this response from Jackson, you can hear his frustration and confusion. He believed that he had sacrificed for his country, protecting its people and helping to secure its safety, far more than any politician like Henry Clay, who had never taken up arms against anyone in defense of the nation. But Jackson's assertion that he was going to retire to private life seems to be a bit naive. This guy was an absolute American rock star. There was no way he was going to be able to retire to the Hermitage like Washington did to Mount Vernon. Sort of. But he tried anyway. After his defeat, he retired from the Senate and moved back home, delighting his wife Rachel, who hated living in Washington, D.C., once complaining that, quote, I would rather be a doorkeeper in the house of God than live in that place in Washington. As I've mentioned before, Andrew Jackson wasted no time to position himself as a presidential candidate for 1828, with his hometown newspaper publicly declaring Jackson as their candidate in 1828 before John Quincy Adams was even inaugurated in 1825. John Eaton, a Tennessee senator and Jackson's number one fan, teamed up with Van Buren and began to establish a strategy for getting the press behind them, creating a network of newspapers throughout the nation that would be sympathetic to and support Jackson's candidacy. As you can imagine, the supporters of Jackson focused their politicking efforts primarily around the corrupt bargain of 1824 and the illegitimacy of Adams' presidency. They often repeated the rumor that Clay had offered his support to both Jackson and Adams in return for the Secretary of State position, and was willing to get behind whichever candidate committed him first. While this rumor was eventually debunked, it didn't really matter. The political impact was effective either way. Once the rumors of Clay's corruption were found to likely be untrue, Jackson and his people just pivoted and began to throw out all kinds of accusations against Adams, claiming he was using patronage to fill the executive with his political allies. They accused him of opposing almost every successful political policy over the last 20 years that benefited the South and the West, and even went as far as to claim he used government funds to buy a pool table and billiard balls. The most ridiculous thing about all these claims isn't just that they were all objectively untrue, but in fact they were creating a narrative that was almost the total opposite of what was actually happening. John Quincy Adams was not corrupt. In fact, almost everything we know about him points to him being incredibly worried about even being considered corrupt, which prompted him to go out of his ways to not act in such ways. As I mentioned last week, Clay and his allies were beyond frustrated with Adams because he wouldn't use patronage to fill the executive with their political allies. John Quincy did almost everything he could to be seen as nonpartisan and neutral, a man trying his hardest to prioritize the nation, putting his country over party. But his national altruism wasn't going to help him during the increasingly volatile campaign season. The worst part about John Quincy Adams' seeming disinterest in getting involved in the political arena wasn't just that he was likely going to lose the election, but all of his allies were suffering by extension, and they were not happy about it. Adams' inaction was setting the U.S. up for a democratic revolution, and momentum was picking up month after month throughout 1827. Henry Clay and Daniel Webster joined together to do everything they could to stop the momentum, but in the end, as we know, it was not going to be enough. But that didn't mean they weren't going to try. And this is where the campaign of 1828 began to get really ugly. The Adams contingent began to circulate a rumor that Jackson's wife Rachel was an adulteress. They claimed that she and Jackson were living together prior to her first husband finalizing the divorce. And look, technically, it was true, but it was being twisted. So let me take a minute to provide some context for you. And keep in mind, this story isn't just indulging in 19th century gossip. It will actually play a pretty critical role in influencing Jackson's perspective of his political opponents moving forward. So, Rachel Donaldson, who later became Andrew Jackson's wife, at the age of 18 married her first husband, Lewis Robarts. It was by all accounts a very unhappy marriage. Rachel and Lewis decided to divorce. Lewis began the divorce process, which at the time had a lot of gray area and was pretty much totally in control of the man, and Rachel assumed it was a done deal. So, figuring she was single now, she moved back into her mother's house in Nashville, and there she met a man named Andrew Jackson, who was renting a room from Rachel's mother at the time. By all accounts, the attraction was immediate, and they fell in love, head over heels for each other. Jackson decided to accompany Rachel on a trip to Natchez, Mississippi, and the two made an impromptu decision to informally marry each other. Of course, as you're probably guessing, Lewis had not finalized the divorce. Thus, Rachel technically married Andrew Jackson while she was still married to another man. When the two returned to Nashville, they soon realized Robarts had not completed the divorce process, and Robarts, furious at Rachel for her actions, accused her publicly of bigamy and finalized the proceedings. Rachel and Andrew finally married again, formally, in 1794, 3 years later. With how little people knew about divorce at the time, and since there was no real evidence of their first, quote, marriage in Natchez, this thing wasn't really a big deal and no one really ever brought it up. But, in case you didn't know, opposition research existed in 1827, and you can bet they weren't going to allow this juicy story to go untold. Some papers likened Rachel to a whore, with others calling her a, quote, dirty black wench. Jackson, meanwhile, was portrayed as a man who openly violated the sanctity of marriage by brazenly stealing another man's wife. To make matters worse, they didn't just slander Jackson for his relationship with Rachel, but this opened up Pandora's box for all kinds of ridiculous claims, with the Cincinnati Gazette, which was one of the most avid opponents of Jackson, declaring, quote, General Jackson's mother was a common prostitute brought to this country by the British soldiers. She afterwards married a mulatto man, with whom she had several children, of whom General Jackson is one. And in case you didn't know, mulatto is a term used to describe biracial people who are part white and part black. Of course, we embrace and celebrate this diversity today and know the power and benefit to our society by our openness to it. But as you can imagine, in 1827 and 1828, the implication was clear. Andrew Jackson was part African American, which in this case somehow would make him an inferior candidate. And to be clear, this wasn't some newspaper editor going rogue or anything. Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, the two men who were working hard to combat Jackson and Van Buren, were enthusiastic about the Cincinnati Gazette's attacks on Jackson, and were brainstorming ways to better support their efforts. And they both knew that this was not the proper way to be going about their business, with Webster nervous that their scheming would become public, writing to Clay that, quote, I hope your office is confidential and trustworthy. All is safe at my end because no one opens my letters. The Republican contingent were also hell-bent on publishing letters from Andrew Jackson that showed his well-known temper and proved that he was horrible at spelling. something that John Quincy and his allies knew about Jackson and were hoping could be used against him. They also made sure to tell stories of the Creek Wars and repeat the reports of Jackson ordering 6 men from his militia court-martialed and executed during the Creek War. The broadside that was distributed was the most effective attack on Jackson out of all of them. It was nicknamed the, quote, coffin handbill, and had the names of the 6 men with the coffin below each one, with the title that read, quote, Some Account of Some of the Bloody Deeds of General Jackson. I'll post a photo of it on social media when I post this episode, and you can see it for yourself. This attack, though, incredibly effective, was very misleading. So, what actually happened was 200 men had tried to mutiny and desert, with most of them being fined. The 6 in charge of the mutiny, though, were found guilty by the courts and sentenced to death through a court-martial. Jackson received the verdict, examined it, signed it, and as a general in the United States Army, ordered it to be executed. Like most things, it wasn't much of a big deal at the time, and no one really even discussed it. But once the campaign season of 1828 began, the story was resurrected and used really effectively against Jackson, describing the act as, quote, cruel and uncalled for, and appeals to every man's best affections and sympathies for the meting out of retributive justice at the ensuing election against the man who had no pity for his fellow man. Jackson was furious about these attacks and was directed by his advisors not to respond, because he had a well-known temper. But man, did he hate Henry Clay for them. Jackson said that Clay was, quote, certainly the basest, meanest scoundrel that ever is graced the image of his God. Jackson, to his credit, controlled his responses, or lack thereof, better than many expected him to. Famous for his temper, Jackson was sure to do his best to stay out of the fray, recognizing that getting involved would likely make things worse for him, his surrogates, and especially his beloved wife, Rachel. Jackson vowed that the, quote, evildoers would be punished. The day of retribution and vengeance must come when the guilty will meet with their just reward. But Jackson wasn't the only one taking a beating of a personal bent. John Quincy also had to fight off his own slander with his opponents, accusing him of abusing public finances and using them for his own personal gain, and even had to try to refute the accusation that while he was minister in Russia, he pimped out his servant to Tsar Alexander. He was accused of anonymously authoring public rebukes of Thomas Jefferson over 20 years earlier and being a Mason in secret. President Adams felt overwhelmed by all of this and described his political opponents, complaining that the 2 houses of Congress are, quote, united by a spirit of bitter, unrelenting, persecuting malice against me individually and against the administration which they conspired to overthrow. This was ugly, ugly politics on both sides. If you were to look up American political mudslinging in the dictionary, the election of 1828 would be a perfect description of it. But I do want to take a moment to recognize John Quincy. While the politics were getting really ugly, and technically his surrogates in Clay and Webster were joining the fray big time, Adams remained separate from this mudslinging. Adams was truly a man who wanted to stay out of partisan fighting as much as he could, and viewed his office and his responsibilities as something to take seriously, and to remain honorable in the process. He likely, by all accounts of historians, had no idea what Clay and Webster were doing behind the scenes, trying to funnel money to newspapers to sling mud at Jackson. And we know this because Adams had been approached during this election cycle for such offers, and he scoffed at them and complained about how terrible and unprincipled these efforts were. But for all of his loss of political momentum, the American people still appreciated President Adams, even if they didn't agree with all of his policies. When he would travel to cities in the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic, crowds would come out to see him and celebrate him, pushing and shoving for the opportunity to shake his hand. But in the end, Adams just wasn't willing to do what it took to politic to win. And it sort of drove everyone around him crazy. Louisa Adams, John Quincy's wife, lamented that, quote, if he would only lend himself a little to the usages and manners of the people without hiding himself and too modestly rejecting their civilities, no man would be more popular. As the election of 1828 approached, it seemed to most that Adams had little chance of retaining his office and achieving his political dreams. And it seemed like he knew it. As I mentioned last week, in the second half of Adams' presidency, he unfortunately had to deal with being the first president to preside over a Congress controlled by the opposition. Not only had the opposition in Congress blunted Adams' ambitious reform efforts up to this point, but now they were going to make it almost impossible for him to get anything done, and in fact, would only be working to ensure his days were numbered. And the outcome of the 1828 election was becoming more and more predictable. As winter turned to spring in 1828, Adams' cabinet was reading the tea leaves and potentially preparing for their next move. Henry Clay, who was exhausted by Adams' work ethic and his own attempts to defend his honor against the political attacks about the corrupt bargain, asked Adams if he could retire. Other members of Adams' cabinet were campaigning for reassignment as minister in London. But Adams figured they were all just trying to save themselves and denied all of their requests. Early in his presidency, not wanting to alienate the North from the South and wanting to maintain a nonpartisan unity in the U.S. as best as he could, Adams did not endorse or take a strong stance on tariffs. But after the Jacksonians took control of Congress in 1826, things began to change. Now, the Adams-Clay Republicans were in favor of tariffs, at least on the surface. Clay had been a supporter of tariffs for over a decade because he believed that tariffs on foreign imports would help keep American goods more competitive and boost American manufacturing. This, of course, was part of Clay's famous American system. But leading up to and during the Adams presidency, the tariff debate became a divisive one, and it's for a strange reason. So after the War of 1812, imported goods from Britain began to skyrocket, right? More goods were coming in from Britain after the war was over. You can naturally expect that. With this, many American manufacturers were clamoring for higher tariffs, so their businesses would be protected and they wouldn't be undercut by these British goods. When a tariff in 1824 was pushed through Congress by none other than Henry Clay, it was beneficial primarily to American manufacturing. But here's the thing. Most all of American manufacturing was in the North, with a little bit in the mid-Atlantic. Therefore, this tariff seemed to benefit only them. In addition to that, it actually made things worse for the South, one could argue. Southern farmers primarily were relying more and more on cotton, indigo, and rice, with cotton being by far the number one producer. Well, their number one trade partner at this time was Britain. But in order for Britain to have the money to buy American goods from the South, they needed to be able to sell enough goods to the North to get the cash to buy them. So, if Britain was not able to sell as many manufactured goods to the U.S. due to the higher tariff, then that means they will have less resources to buy the southern crops. With the prices of cotton plummeting during John Quincy Adams' presidency, Southerners pointed directly toward the increased tariff of 1824 as the primary culprit, even though it really wasn't quite that simple. And tariffs aren't that simple either. They can be incredibly complicated and favor one geographic region or industry over another, depending on how they're worded. When the Jacksonians in Congress, led by Martin Van Buren and John C. Calhoun, took up responsibility for negotiating another tariff, they were sure to make it one that would benefit all of the southern and western states. States they had hoped would vote for Jackson in 1828. And yes, you heard me correctly. John C. Calhoun, the sitting vice president, had already publicly turned his back on his president, John Quincy Adams, and endorsed Andrew Jackson, agreeing to be on his ticket as his running mate in 1828. Probably never see that again in American history. The tariff that Van Buren and the Jacksonians came up with seemed like a joke. It clearly cherry-picked certain industries and goods, raising the tariff on some and not on others, obviously benefiting the southern and western states far more than the North and the Mid-Atlantic. It was so obviously political, it was dubbed the Tariff of Abominations. Now, there were some benefits for select manufacturers and traders in the North, specifically in key regions. And this was purposeful, and it was important. It was believed that the Democrats in Congress were going through the motions to create this bill with little to no expectation it would pass, and that John Quincy would likely veto it. But they knew if it didn't pass, those Northerners in states like Pennsylvania and New York that actually would have benefited from it would be furious with Adams, and those were two really important states in the upcoming election. John Quincy was staring down the barrel of a lose-lose proposition, and everyone seemed to know exactly what was going on, with Henry Clay complaining that, quote, "The Jackson party is playing a game of brag on that subject. They do not really desire the passage of their own measure, and it may happen in the sequel that what is desired by neither party commands the support of both." Not knowing exactly what to do, Clay and Adams convinced their allies to vote for it, knowing they would need votes from some of the Midwestern and Northern states that did benefit. Either way, though, he was going to make people angry. And that's exactly what happened. And the Tariff of 1828, nicknamed the Tariff of Abominations, seemed to be the final nail in John Quincy's political coffin. As spring turned to summer in 1828, Henry Clay decided to get more involved in the campaigning, realizing that his political future was likely tied up in Adams' re-election hopes, whether he liked it or not. By the fall of 1828, Adams knew his days were numbered, but Webster and Clay were convincing themselves that Adams still had a chance to win. On December 3rd, 1828, it became official. John Quincy had lost the election, becoming only the second president not to serve a second term, with the first, of course, being his father, John Adams. But at least John Adams' re-election effort was close. John Quincy's was not. Jackson and Calhoun won the Electoral College 178 to 83, a crushing defeat for a sitting president. Along with this, the Jacksonians, who were beginning to refer to themselves as the Democrats, gained majorities in both the House and the Senate. Jackson had been vindicated. The American people had supported him and his belief in having the election of 1824 stolen from him and overwhelmingly voted him into office. The only issue that Jackson was left to consider was just how much Rachel hated Washington, D.C. Jackson's victory had forced the hand of his wife, and he knew that she was going to be miserable living alongside him in Washington, being in the spotlight and continuing to be the focus of political and personal attacks. And while Adams wasn't surprised by the results, he was saddened by them, writing that, quote, "The sun of my political career sets in deepest gloom, but that of the country shines unclouded." With his political future ended, or so it seemed, Adams spent the rest of his days in the White House enjoying the time he had, meeting with visitors and exercising, all the while trying to figure out what he was going to do for the rest of his life in order to continue to support his family. The presidents before him had been expected to retire quietly out of the public eye, but Adams did not have the money to do that, whether he wanted to or not. Harvard had offered him the role as president, again, but Adams believed he was too worn down to perform a job with such responsibility at this stage of his life. Like his father before him, John Quincy Adams couldn't bring himself to attending the inauguration of his successor. John Quincy had heard rumors that Jackson blamed him for all the mudslinging in the campaign, even though Jackson had very little to do with it. Adams, believing this, didn't feel it would be appropriate to attend Jackson's inauguration, as it would take away from the moment, or at least that's how he justified it. In the end, there were pretty good chances that both he and his father were embarrassed by the single terms in office, and didn't want to face the pain of this embarrassment by watching their opponent inaugurated, essentially taking their job from them in public. As you pack up your things, I'd like you to take a moment to reflect on the past 4 years of the Adams presidency. While I know that campaigning of 1828 is the most interesting part of Adams' time in office, he deserves to be credited for the progress he was trying to lead in the United States. John Quincy had a vision for this nation that he was unrelenting from. He wanted to empower the national government to help support the American system of manufacturing and internal improvements so he could strengthen the nation and protect it against future threats, far more than it had been in the past. Adams recognized that America was on the cusp of becoming a world power, and he wanted to do everything he could to make sure he saw it break through. But although Adams tried to significantly expand the government, he wasn't able to do as much as you would think because of congressional and popular resistance. In fact, Adams was pretty scrupulous with what the government paid for, limiting federal employees and working hard to try to pay down the federal debt. But perception is reality, and his words supported a radical increase from the federal government, and that is what people remember. When you look through the history of the world, you come to see that with every revolution, it seems to bring with it a counter-revolution. When the people of a nation or region believe the pendulum has swung too far in one direction, it often swings back the other way rapidly, for better or for worse. We'll see this in many ways in the administration of Andrew Jackson. The next 8 years of U.S. history will be some of the most consequential non-war years in our nation's history, and we will have a lot to unpack. Thanks for listening, and hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed.